My own daughter tried to steal everything I had built in 73 years of living, and I almost let her do it. Almost. But before I tell you how I stopped her, let me ask you something. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share happened right here in America, in a place where family is supposed to mean something. Where trust is supposed to matter. If you've ever loved someone so much that you'd give them anything, only to have them use that love against you, then you'll understand every word of what I'm about to tell you. And if this story moves you, if it makes you think about your own family, your own trust, please hit that subscribe button, because stories like this need to be heard. They need to be shared. They need to serve as warnings. My name is Beverly, and I used to believe that being a mother meant trusting your children no matter what. I used to believe that family came first, always. I used to believe a lot of things that nearly cost me everything I had worked for, everything I had saved, everything I had planned to leave behind as my legacy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really began, not at the bank where everything exploded, but 6 months earlier, when my daughter Cheryl came to me with tears in her eyes and a story that broke my heart. It was a Tuesday evening in March. I remember because I had just finished my weekly call with my financial advisor, going over my portfolio like I had every Tuesday for the past 15 years. At 73, I had managed to accumulate what most people would consider a comfortable retirement, $340,000 in various accounts, a paid-off house worth about $200,000, and enough monthly income from Social Security and my late husband's pension to live comfortably without touching the principal. I had worked hard for that security. 38 years as a high school English teacher, summers spent tutoring, evenings grading papers while my husband worked double shifts at the factory. We saved every penny we could, drove used cars until they died, took vacations at state parks instead of fancy resorts. When Robert passed 5 years ago, I promised myself I would honor his memory by being smart with the money we had sacrificed so much to accumulate. Cheryl knew all of this. She had watched us scrimp and save through her childhood, had seen us choose practical over pretty, necessary over nice. She had also been the beneficiary of our careful planning. We paid for her college education without her taking a single loan, helped with the down payment on her first house, and had been there financially whenever she faced a real crisis. But that Tuesday evening, she sat in my living room crying harder than I had seen her cry since her divorce 8 years earlier. "Mom, I don't know what we're going to do," she sobbed, her mascara creating dark rivers down her cheeks. "Daniel's business is failing. The construction company is going under, and we're going to lose everything." Daniel was her second husband, a man she had married 3 years earlier after a whirlwind romance that had made me slightly uncomfortable from the beginning. Not because he wasn't charming, he was incredibly charming. Tall, handsome, with the kind of confident smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo. But there was something about the way he looked at things, the way he assessed value, that reminded me of a pawn shop owner evaluating items to buy. Still, Cheryl loved him, and after her bitter divorce from her first husband, I wanted nothing more than to see her happy. So I welcomed Daniel into the family, despite the nagging feeling in my gut that something wasn't quite right. "How bad is it?" I asked, reaching across to take her hand. "We're 3 months behind on the mortgage," she whispered. "The bank is starting foreclosure proceedings. Daniel's business owes money to suppliers, to subcontractors. Some of them are threatening to sue. We might have to declare bankruptcy, Mom. We might lose the house, everything." My heart broke watching her pain. This was my little girl, my only child, the person I loved more than my own life. The house she was talking about losing was the same house I had helped them buy. The place where I had spent countless holidays and birthdays with my grandchildren. Wait, I should mention the grandchildren. Cheryl had 2 kids from her first marriage, Emma, who was 16, and Jake, who was 14. They had been living with Cheryl and Daniel for the past 2 years, and I couldn't bear the thought of them losing their stability again. They had already been through so much with the divorce, had finally seemed to settle into a routine. "What can I do to help?" I asked, though part of me already knew where this conversation was headed. Cheryl looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Mom, I hate to ask this. I hate it so much. But we need about $50,000 to catch up on everything and keep the business afloat. Daniel thinks if we can just get through this rough patch, he can turn things around. The construction market is picking up, and he has some big projects lined up for this summer." $50,000. It was a lot of money, but it wasn't everything. I could help them without putting myself at serious financial risk, and if it meant keeping my grandchildren stable and my daughter's marriage intact, it felt like the right thing to do. "Okay, I said after a moment of consideration. I can help with that. We'll need to be careful about how we structure it, maybe as a loan with reasonable terms, so there are protections for both of us. The relief on Cheryl's face was immediate and overwhelming. She threw her arms around me, sobbing grateful thanks into my shoulder. For a moment, I felt like the hero of the story, the mother who could solve her daughter's problems and make everything right again. But here's what I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until much later. Daniel wasn't in the room during this conversation for a reason. He was in the kitchen, listening carefully to every word, making mental notes about my financial situation. That night, after they went home, he would start researching exactly how much I was worth, how much I had access to, and what the legal procedures would be for gaining control of it all. He was already planning to take everything. The loan was supposed to be temporary. We structured it properly, with paperwork and terms. Cheryl would pay me back over 3 years at a modest interest rate. Daniel signed the papers with a grateful smile, shook my hand firmly, and looked me in the eye when he promised this would solve their problems. For 3 months, everything seemed to be working. They made their first payment on time, Daniel's business appeared to be recovering, and family dinners returned to their normal, comfortable rhythm. Emma was doing well in school, Jake had joined the baseball team, and Cheryl seemed happier than she had been in years. I should have known it was too good to last. The first sign of trouble came in June when Cheryl called to say they would be a few days late with their second payment. Daniel had a big job finishing up, she explained, and the client was slow to pay. Nothing to worry about, they would have my money the following week. The following week came and went. Then another week. When I finally called to ask about the payment, Daniel answered the phone. "Beverly, I'm glad you called," he said in that smooth, confident voice of his. "I wanted to talk to you about the loan situation. The thing is, we're having some cash flow issues that are bigger than we initially thought. I'm wondering if we might be able to restructure the terms, maybe stretch the payments out over 5 years instead of 3. Something in his tone bothered me, a casualness that hadn't been there when he was desperate for the money. But I was still thinking like a mother, still prioritizing Cheryl's happiness over my own financial security. "We can talk about it," I said carefully. "Why don't we set up a meeting to go over everything?" "Actually," Daniel said, "I was thinking we might want to involve a financial planner in these discussions. Someone who could help us figure out the best way to structure things going forward. Cheryl and I have been talking, and we're worried about your financial security too, Beverly. You're 73 years old, and managing all these investments and accounts must be getting complicated." Warning bells should have been ringing in my head. They should have been deafening. But all I heard was what sounded like a son-in-law expressing concern for my well-being, a family working together to solve problems. "I appreciate the concern," I said, "but I have a financial advisor already, and I'm managing just fine." Of course, Daniel said smoothly. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just thought it might be helpful to have someone who could look at the whole family picture. You know? Someone who could help us plan for the long term, make sure everyone's protected." That conversation planted the first seed of what would eventually become their plan to take control of my finances entirely. But at the time, I thought it was just an overextended son-in-law trying to find creative solutions to temporary problems. I had no idea that Daniel had already been researching elder law, learning about power of attorney documents, and figuring out exactly how to convince an elderly person to sign over control of their assets for their own protection. The really sick part is that he was using my love for Cheryl and the grandchildren as the weapon against me. Every conversation, every suggestion, every manipulation was wrapped in concern for the family's welfare. How could I argue with wanting to protect my own daughter and grandchildren? By the end of June, I had agreed to meet with a financial planner that Daniel had found. Not because I needed one, but because I wanted to show that I was a team player, that I cared about the family's collective financial health. That meeting would be the beginning of the most elaborate and heartbreaking betrayal I have ever experienced. The financial planner's office was in one of those modern buildings downtown, all glass and steel and an impressive view of the city. His name was Marcus Webb, and everything about him screamed competence and trustworthiness. Expensive suit, confident handshake, walls covered with certificates and awards. Daniel had clearly chosen well. If you've ever been in a situation where you felt like something was wrong but couldn't quite put your finger on what it was, you know that unsettled feeling I had walking into that office. It was like sensing a storm coming while the sky was still mostly blue. Cheryl was there, of course, sitting next to Daniel with a smile that seemed just a little too bright, a little too rehearsed. She hugged me when I arrived and whispered in my ear, "Thank you so much for doing this, Mom. It means everything to us." Marcus Webb launched into a presentation that was clearly prepared in advance, complete with charts and projections and scenarios that painted a picture of financial vulnerability I had never considered. According to him, my current situation was far riskier than I realized. "Beverly," he said, leaning forward with practiced concern, "at your age, you're facing several potential challenges that could seriously impact your financial security. Healthcare costs are rising at an alarming rate. The stock market is increasingly volatile. And frankly, managing a portfolio this size becomes more difficult as we age, especially if health issues arise." He showed me statistics about elderly Americans losing money to scams, making poor investment decisions due to cognitive decline, or being taken advantage of by unscrupulous financial advisors. Every example, every story, every warning was designed to make me feel vulnerable and incompetent. But here's the thing, I wasn't incompetent. I had been managing money successfully for decades. My portfolio was performing well, my expenses were under control, and my current financial advisor was someone I had worked with for 15 years, someone Robert and I had vetted carefully before trusting him with our life savings. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. Marcus exchanged a glance with Daniel before continuing. "Well, one option that many families in situations like yours find helpful is to establish a more collaborative approach to financial management. Instead of having everything in your name alone, you could add Cheryl as a joint owner on your accounts. That way, if anything happened to you, there would be no complications with probate, no delays in accessing funds for your care. It would also mean," Cheryl added quickly, "that if you ever needed help managing things, I could step in without any legal complications. You'd still have complete control, Mom, but there would be a backup plan." The way she said it made it sound so reasonable, so caring. A daughter looking out for her aging mother's best interests. But something about the eagerness in Daniel's eyes made me pause. "I appreciate the concern," I said slowly, "but I'm not ready to make any major changes right now. Let me think about all of this and maybe get a second opinion from my own advisor." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's smile became more strained, and Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But it was Cheryl's reaction that really disturbed me, a flash of something that looked almost like anger before she quickly recovered her composure. "Of course, Mom," she said. "We just want what's best for you. But maybe you could at least consider some smaller steps. Marcus has some ideas about better investment strategies that could increase your returns while reducing risk." What followed was an hour of high-pressure sales tactics disguised as family concern. Marcus presented investment opportunities that would require moving money from my current accounts into new ones that he would manage. Coincidentally, these new accounts would also make it easier to add Cheryl as a joint owner when I was ready. I left that meeting feeling like I had been through a blender. Part of me was flattered by their concern and attention. Another part was confused by financial concepts and strategies that were presented as urgent necessities. But underneath it all was a growing suspicion that I was being manipulated. That night, I called my longtime financial advisor, Gerald Morrison. Jerry had been managing my money since Robert and I first started planning for retirement, and I trusted his judgment completely. "Jerry," I said, "I need an honest assessment. Am I making mistakes with my money? Am I missing opportunities or exposing myself to unnecessary risks?" He was quiet for a moment before responding. "Beverly, in the 15 years I've worked with you, you've been one of my most sensible and successful clients. Your portfolio is well diversified, your spending is conservative, and your financial planning is sound. Why are you asking?" I told him about the meeting with Marcus Webb, about the pressure to make changes and add joint owners to my accounts. As I described the conversation, I could hear Jerry's breathing change. "Beverly," he said carefully, "everything you're describing sounds like the beginning of what we call financial elder abuse. The tactics, the urgency, the suggestions about joint ownership, these are classic warning signs. I've seen this happen to other clients, and it rarely ends well." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Financial elder abuse. My own daughter. But Cheryl wouldn't. I started to say. "Maybe not intentionally," Jerry interrupted gently. "Maybe she genuinely believes she's helping. But her husband, this Marcus Webb, Beverly, you need to be very careful here. Once you add someone as a joint owner to your accounts, they have the same access to your money that you do. They can withdraw funds, make investment changes, even empty accounts entirely without your permission or knowledge. I spent the rest of that conversation learning about things I had never imagined I would need to know. How adult children manipulate elderly parents into signing over financial control. How these schemes often start with genuine family financial problems but evolve into outright theft. How quickly a lifetime of savings can disappear once the wrong person gains access. By the time I hung up the phone, I was shaking. But I was also angry. Not just at Daniel and his accomplice Marcus Webb, but at myself for almost falling for it. And if I'm being completely honest, I was starting to feel the first stirrings of something else. A desire for justice, for consequences, for these people who thought they could take advantage of an old woman to learn exactly how wrong they were. The next few weeks were a careful dance of seeming cooperation while I gathered information. I agreed to another meeting with Marcus Webb, but this time I brought a small digital recorder in my purse. I listened to Daniel's suggestions about simplifying my financial arrangements while making mental notes about his tactics. I nodded thoughtfully when Cheryl expressed concern about my ability to manage my affairs while privately documenting every manipulation attempt. What I discovered was that this wasn't a desperate family seeking help. It was a calculated operation designed to gain control of my assets. Daniel's business wasn't just struggling, it was a complete fabrication. The construction company existed only on paper, created specifically to provide a believable story for borrowing money. The suppliers and subcontractors who were supposedly threatening lawsuits didn't exist either. The $50,000 I had loaned them had gone directly into Daniel's personal account, and from there had been spent on luxury purchases, a new truck, expensive electronics, a vacation to Las Vegas that they had told me was a business conference. But the loan was just the beginning. The real plan was to gain control of all my assets through a combination of joint ownership and power of attorney documents, then slowly drain my accounts while keeping me pacified with small allowances and explanations about market fluctuations and necessary expenses. I learned all of this through a private investigator I hired. Yes, at 73 years old, I hired a private investigator to investigate my own daughter and son-in-law. His name was Tony Rodriguez, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was paying someone to spy on my own family. But by that point, I knew that's exactly what they had become, not family, but criminals who happened to share my DNA. Tony's investigation revealed the full scope of their plan. They had already prepared power of attorney documents that would give them complete control over my finances. They had researched my assets thoroughly, including accounts I had never mentioned to them. They had even consulted with an attorney about the fastest way to liquidate various investments once they gained access. Most heartbreaking of all, I learned that Cheryl was not an innocent victim being manipulated by her husband. The private investigator found records of phone calls and text messages that proved she was an active, willing participant in the scheme. In fact, some of the most calculating and cold-blooded strategies had been her ideas. Reading those transcripts of her conversations with Daniel was like having my heart torn out. My own daughter, the child I had raised with love and sacrifice and endless devotion, talking about me like I was nothing more than a bank account to be emptied. Referring to me as the old lady and discussing my eventual death like it was a financial opportunity rather than the loss of their mother and grandmother. But if they thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who would quietly hand over her life savings, they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. I started planning my own operation. Not just to protect my money, but to expose their scheme in a way that would have real consequences. I wanted them to face legal repercussions for what they were trying to do. I wanted other elderly people to see what these schemes looked like so they could protect themselves. And yes, I wanted revenge. Because this wasn't just about money. This was about trust, about family, about everything I had believed in for 7 decades of life. They hadn't just tried to steal my assets, they had shattered my faith in the most fundamental relationship I had ever known. The plan I developed would require patience, careful timing, and the kind of acting skills I had never known I possessed. But I was motivated by something more powerful than greed or desperation. I was motivated by the righteous anger of a mother betrayed. And I was about to turn their own plan against them in ways they never saw coming. Playing the part of a confused, vulnerable old woman was harder than I expected. Not because I couldn't fake confusion. After 73 years on this earth, I had plenty of experience with people underestimating me. The hard part was suppressing my rage every time Cheryl looked at me with those fake sympathetic eyes or Daniel put his hand on my shoulder with pretend concern. But I had a plan now, and that plan required an Oscar-worthy performance. The next meeting with Marcus Webb was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late July. This time, they wanted me to bring all my financial documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, insurance policies, everything. They claimed it was so Marcus could do a comprehensive review of my situation and make better recommendations. In reality, as I now knew, it was so they could map out exactly what they were going to steal and in what order. I arrived at Marcus's office carrying a large folder of documents, playing the part of an elderly woman who was overwhelmed by financial complexity and grateful for help. I had practiced my lines in the mirror, rehearsed the right mix of confusion and trust that would make them think I was ready to hand over control. "I've been thinking about what you all said," I began, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk. "About how complicated it's getting to manage everything on my own. Maybe you're right that I need more help." The change in the room's energy was immediate. Daniel leaned forward with barely contained excitement. Cheryl reached over to pat my hand with what she probably thought was reassuring comfort. Marcus Webb's smile became genuinely warm for the first time since I had met him. "I'm so glad you're open to letting us help you, Mom," Cheryl said. "We just want to make sure you're protected and secure." Protected and secure. The words tasted like poison in the air. Marcus spread my documents across his desk with the reverence of a treasure hunter examining a long-sought map. As he reviewed each account statement, each investment summary, I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Dollar signs might as well have been flashing in his pupils. "Beverly, this is quite impressive," he said. "You and Robert did an excellent job building this portfolio. But I can see some areas where we could improve performance and, more importantly, simplify management for you." What followed was the same high-pressure presentation from our first meeting, but this time I was ready for it. I asked the right questions to seem interested but not too sophisticated. I expressed concern about making mistakes. I mentioned worry about what would happen if I became ill or incapacitated. I was giving them exactly the opening they had been working toward. "One thing that would really help," Daniel said, jumping in at what he clearly thought was the perfect moment, "would be to add Cheryl to your accounts as a joint owner. That way, if anything happens to you, there's no disruption in managing your affairs. And if you ever need help with day-to-day financial tasks, she can handle those for you." "It would give you such peace of mind, Mom," Cheryl added. "And it would give me peace of mind too, knowing that you have someone looking out for you." The irony of her talking about peace of mind while planning to rob me blind was almost too much to bear. But I forced myself to stay in character. "That sounds like it might be a good idea," I said slowly, as if considering it for the first time. "But how would that work exactly?" Marcus Webb leaned forward with the enthusiasm of a salesman who can smell a commission. "It's actually quite simple. We just need to fill out some paperwork to add Cheryl as a joint owner on your primary accounts. She would have the same access you do, which means she could help with transactions, monitor account activity, and handle any issues that arise. And," Daniel added with what he probably thought was casual cleverness, "we should probably also set up a power of attorney document. That way, if you're ever unable to make decisions for yourself, heaven forbid, Cheryl can step in immediately without having to go through courts or lawyers." There it was. The full scope of their plan laid out in the open. Joint ownership for immediate access to my money, power of attorney for complete control over my decisions. Once those documents were signed, I would be effectively helpless while they drained every penny I had. Would I still be able to access my own money? I asked, playing the part of someone who was concerned but not suspicious. "Of course," Cheryl said quickly. "Nothing would change for you, Mom. You'd have the same access to everything you've always had. I would just be there as a backup, as additional security." Additional security. I almost laughed at the audacity of it. "Well," I said after a moment of pretended consideration, "I suppose it does make sense to have someone I trust involved in managing things." The relief on their faces was almost comical. They thought they had one. They thought the old lady had bought their story and was ready to hand over her life savings. "Should we start the paperwork?" Marcus asked, already reaching for a folder of pre-prepared documents. "Actually," I said, and I watched their faces carefully as I continued, "I'd like my grandson Jake to be part of this conversation. He's studying business in high school, and I think it would be good for him to learn about financial planning." The request clearly caught them off guard. Daniel and Cheryl exchanged a quick glance, and I could see the wheels turning in their heads. Having Jake present wasn't part of their plan. but they couldn't object without seeming unreasonable. "That's a lovely idea," Cheryl said after a pause, "but Jake is in school right now. Maybe we could include him in a future meeting." "Oh, I already arranged for him to join us," I said with a smile. "I called the school this morning and explained that he would be learning about family financial planning. He should be here any minute." This was a lie, of course. Jake was in school, unaware of any of this drama. But I needed to buy myself time to execute the next phase of my plan, and their obvious discomfort with additional witnesses was telling. "Actually," Daniel said, clearly trying to regain control of the situation, "maybe we should focus on getting the basic paperwork started today. We can always have Jake involved in future discussions about investment strategies and long-term planning." "Oh, but I'd really like him to be here for the important stuff," I insisted. "Family financial decisions should involve the whole family, don't you think?" I was watching Marcus Webb's face as I said this, and I could see frustration creeping into his expression. This wasn't going according to their timeline, and in the con game, timing is everything. "Beverly," Marcus said with forced patience, "I understand wanting to include Jake, but some of these documents are quite complex. It might be better to handle the legal aspects with just the adults present, and then we can have educational discussions with Jake later." "The legal aspects?" I repeated, as if the phrase worried me. "This all sounds more complicated than I thought. Maybe I should have my attorney review these documents before I sign anything." If the previous suggestion about Jake had made them uncomfortable, the mention of my attorney made them panic. Not visibly, they were too practiced for that, but I could see the subtle signs. Daniel's hand clenched on his coffee cup. Cheryl's smile became strained. Marcus Webb's eyes darted toward the documents on his desk as if he wanted to hide them. "Oh, Mom," Cheryl said quickly, "you don't need to bother Harold with this. These are standard documents, and having a lawyer involved would just slow everything down and cost you money unnecessarily." Harold Brennan was indeed my attorney, the same man who had handled Robert's will and had been managing my legal affairs for over 20 years. He was also someone who would see through their scheme immediately and advise me against signing anything. "I suppose you're right," I said, as if her argument was convincing. "Harold is getting pretty old himself. Maybe he's not the best choice for modern financial planning." "Exactly," Daniel said, seizing the opening. "This isn't really a legal matter anyway. It's just family taking care of family. The documents Marcus has are standard forms that banks use all the time." Standard forms. I had to admire their commitment to the lie, even when it was so transparently false. "Well," I said, reaching for my purse, "I suppose if you're all sure this is the right thing to do." They leaned forward expectantly, thinking I was about to agree to sign their papers. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. "I'm just going to call Harold quickly," I said with a sweet smile. "Not to ask his legal opinion, just to let him know what we're doing. He likes to stay informed about my financial decisions." The silence in that room was deafening. 3 people who had been absolutely certain they were about to complete a major financial fraud suddenly realized their Mark wasn't as helpless as they had assumed. Marcus Webb was the first to recover. "You know what, Beverly? Maybe today isn't the best day to handle all of this paperwork. Why don't we schedule another meeting when we can really take our time and make sure you're completely comfortable with everything?" "Oh, but I'm here now," I said innocently. "And I brought all my documents like you asked. Are you sure we can't at least get started?" "It's just that these decisions shouldn't be rushed," Cheryl said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "We want to make sure you have time to think everything through." Think everything through. From the people who had been pressuring me for weeks to sign documents that would give them complete access to my life savings. I looked around the room at these 3 people who thought they were so much smarter than a 73-year-old retired English teacher. They had no idea that I had spent the last month documenting their every move, recording their conversations, and building a case that would destroy them. But that confrontation would come later. For now, I was content to watch them squirm as their perfect plan began to unravel. "You know what?" I said, standing up and beginning to gather my documents. "Maybe you're right. This is a big decision, and I should take some time to think about it. Can we reschedule for next week?" The relief on their faces was palpable, but I could also see the calculation happening. They needed to figure out how to get back on track, how to separate me from any potential interference, how to complete their scheme before I had time to seek outside advice. As we scheduled another meeting, I was already planning the final act of this drama. Because next week, when we met again, it wouldn't be in Marcus Webb's office with his carefully prepared documents and practice sales pitch. Next week, we would be meeting at my bank, with my documents and my plan. And that's when they would learn exactly what happens when you try to steal from someone who has spent 40 years teaching teenagers, someone who has seen every manipulation tactic in the book and developed a few of her own. The week between that meeting and our next scheduled appointment was the longest week of my life. Not because I was anxious about confronting them. By that point, I was looking forward to it. The hard part was maintaining my performance whenever Cheryl called or stopped by, pretending I was still the confused old woman who was grateful for their help. And she did call. Multiple times. Every conversation was carefully designed to reinforce their narrative and keep me moving towards signing those documents. "Hi Mom, I was just thinking about our meeting with Marcus," she would say. "I hope you're not worrying about anything. Daniel and I just want what's best for you." Or, "I've been talking to some of my friends, and they all think it's so smart that you're getting professional help with your finances. A lot of people our age have children who help manage these things." Our age. Cheryl was 42 years old, but she had started referring to herself as if she were a peer, someone who understood the challenges of aging in ways her elderly mother couldn't. The manipulation was so constant and so insidious that I began to understand how other elderly people fall for these schemes. The people they trust most, their own children, are telling them they're making mistakes, that they need help, that they're becoming a burden. After weeks or months of this psychological pressure, many people start to believe it's true. But I had an advantage they didn't know about. I knew exactly what they were doing and why. I used that week to finalize my own preparations. The private investigator had gathered enough evidence to build a solid case for attempted financial elder abuse. The small digital recorder I had been carrying was full of conversations where they discussed their plans to take control of my money. My longtime financial advisor had prepared detailed documentation showing that my portfolio was being managed competently and didn't need the improvements they were suggesting. Most importantly, I had contacted Sandra Williams, the manager at First National Bank where I had done business for over 30 years. Sandra had known me since she was a teller, had worked with me through Robert's death and the subsequent changes to my accounts, and understood my financial situation better than almost anyone. When I explained to her what was happening, she was horrified but not surprised. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, she had never called me Beverly, even after all these years. "I see this more often than you might think. Adult children who get desperate or greedy and decide their parents' money should be their inheritance right now, instead of waiting. I want to catch them in the act," I told her. "I want them on record, trying to force me to sign documents that would give them access to my accounts. Can you help me with that?" Sandra's smile was fierce with determination. "Mrs. Patterson, it would be my pleasure to help you catch these thieves. What did you have in mind?" We spent an hour planning what would happen when I brought Cheryl and Daniel to the bank. Sandra would have security cameras focused on our area, with audio recording equipment positioned to capture every word. She would also have a security guard nearby, ready to intervene if things escalated. And she would have the phone number for Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit, someone who could respond immediately if we needed law enforcement. But the most important element of our plan was a simple one. If I felt pressured or threatened during the meeting, I would slip Sandra a note asking for help. That would be her signal to lock the doors and call the police. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Sandra asked. "These confrontations can get emotional, especially with family members involved." I thought about everything Cheryl and Daniel had put me through over the past few months. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal of trust that had taken me 73 years to build. I thought about other elderly people who might fall victim to similar schemes because no one had been willing to expose the tactics these predators use. "I'm sure," I said. The call came on Friday afternoon. Cheryl sounded excited, almost breathless with anticipation. "Mom, great news. Marcus had a cancellation on Monday morning, and he can fit us in earlier than we planned. But here's the thing, he's suggesting we handle the paperwork directly at the bank instead of his office. That way, we can get everything set up immediately without having to make multiple trips." My heart started racing, but not with fear, with anticipation. They were walking directly into the trap I had set. "At the bank," I said, trying to sound uncertain. "Why would we do that?" "It's actually more convenient," Daniel's voice came through the phone. Apparently he had been listening on another extension. We can sign the joint ownership papers and get them processed immediately, instead of having to come back later. Marcus says it's a much more efficient way to handle everything. More efficient for them, certainly. They were probably worried that I was having second thoughts, that the longer they waited, the more likely I was to seek outside advice or change my mind entirely. They wanted to get those papers signed before I had another chance to think things through. Which bank? I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew the answer. First National, Cheryl said. Since that's where most of your accounts are, it makes sense to handle everything there. We're scheduled for 10 a.m. on Monday. Does that work for you? Perfect. It was exactly what I had been hoping for, but I couldn't let them know that. I suppose that's fine, I said with the right amount of hesitation. Should I bring anything special? Just your ID and maybe one of your bank statements, Daniel said. Marcus will handle everything else. Oh, and Mom? This is really going to simplify your life. You're going to wonder why we didn't do this sooner. You're going to wonder why you tried to steal from me, I thought, but what I said was, I hope you're right. After I hung up, I called Sandra immediately to confirm our preparations. Everything was in place. The security cameras, the recording equipment, the backup plan if things went wrong. Detective Morrison would be on standby, ready to respond within minutes if we needed him. Are you nervous? Sandra asked. Terrified, I admitted. But also excited. These people have put me through hell for months, and they have no idea what's coming. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for what I knew would be a dark day for Cheryl and Daniel. I dressed carefully, a simple blue dress that made me look like exactly what they expected to see, a harmless elderly woman who could be easily manipulated. I arrived at the bank a few minutes before 10, giving Sandra time to activate all our security measures and brief the staff who would be involved. She met me at the entrance with a professional smile that masked the tension we both felt. Good morning, Mrs. Patterson, she said loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. I understand you're here to discuss some account changes. Yes, I replied in the voice of a woman who wasn't entirely sure what she was doing. My daughter and son-in-law are meeting me here with their financial advisor to help me organize my accounts better. Sandra nodded and led me to a small conference room near the back of the bank's main floor. The room had a large window overlooking the lobby, but Sandra had positioned the chairs so that anyone sitting with their back to the door would be unaware that they were being observed and recorded from multiple angles. Cheryl and Daniel arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by Marcus Webb. All three were dressed professionally and wore expressions of confident authority. They looked like exactly what they were pretending to be. Legitimate financial advisors helping an elderly client organize her affairs. If I hadn't known better, even I might have been impressed by their act. Hi Mom, Cheryl said, giving me a hug that felt cold despite her warm smile. Are you excited about getting all this sorted out? A little nervous, I admitted, which was completely true for reasons she couldn't imagine. Marcus Webb had brought a leather briefcase full of documents, which he spread across the conference table with practiced efficiency. Everything looked official and important: bank forms, signature cards, power of attorney documents, investment transfer authorizations. Beverly, he began in that smooth, confident voice, today we're going to take care of everything we discussed. By the time we leave here, your financial situation will be much more organized and secure. Secure for them, maybe. Sandra took her position at a desk visible through the conference room window, where she could monitor our meeting while appearing to work on other tasks. I had already slipped her a note when I arrived, letting her know that everything was proceeding according to plan, but asking her to be ready for my signal if things escalated. Now, Marcus continued, the first thing we need to do is add Cheryl as a joint owner on your primary checking and savings accounts. This form authorizes the bank to give her the same access to these accounts that you have. He placed a document in front of me and offered me a pen. It was really happening. They were about to ask me to sign away access to my life savings, confident that I was too old and confused to understand what I was doing. What exactly does this mean? I asked, playing my part perfectly. It means that Cheryl can help you with your banking, Daniel explained with false patience. She can make deposits, write checks, monitor account activity, anything you need help with. You'll still have complete control, but she'll be there as backup. Complete control. The lie was so outrageous I almost broke character. And this one? I asked, pointing to another document. That's a power of attorney form, Marcus said. It gives Cheryl the legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf if you're ever unable to do so yourself. It's just a precaution, but it's very important to have in place. A precaution that would let them empty my accounts the moment I signed it. I picked up the pen and held it over the first document. All three of them leaned forward slightly, barely able to contain their excitement as they watched me prepare to sign away my financial independence. But instead of signing, I set the pen down and looked around the room. You know, I said slowly, I'm still not completely comfortable with this. It feels like such a big step. The frustration on their faces was immediate and barely concealed. Mom, Cheryl said with forced patience, we've discussed this so many times. This is what's best for you. We're your family, we're trying to help you. I know, sweetheart, I said. But maybe we should slow down a little bit. Maybe I should have Harold look at these documents first, or... Beverly, Daniel interrupted, his voice sharper than it had been before, we've been planning this for weeks. Marcus has cleared his schedule to be here, the bank is ready to process everything, and honestly, you're overthinking this. His tone had changed completely. Gone was the patient, caring son-in-law. This was the voice of a man who was tired of pretending and wanted to get on with stealing my money. I just think, I started to say. Mom, just sign the papers, Cheryl said firmly. We know what's best for you, and you need to trust us on this. The mask was slipping. The caring daughter act was being replaced by something much uglier. The voice of someone who was frustrated that their victim wasn't cooperating quickly enough. I don't know, I said, letting my voice sound confused and a little frightened. That's when Daniel made his fatal mistake. He stood up from his chair and moved behind me, placing his hand on my shoulder. But it wasn't a comforting gesture, his grip was firm, almost threatening. Beverly, he said, his voice now openly intimidating, you're going to sign these documents. We've put too much time and effort into this to have you back out now. His hand tightened on my shoulder, just enough to hurt, just enough to make his meaning clear. Cheryl is your daughter, Marcus added, his own professional mask beginning to slip. She has your best interests at heart. You need to trust your family and sign these papers. I looked up at Cheryl, hoping against hope that she would tell Daniel to back off, that she would remember she was supposed to be protecting me, not threatening me. Instead, she picked up the pen and held it out to me. Just sign it, Mom, she said coldly. We don't have all day. That was the moment. That was when I knew beyond any doubt that my own daughter had chosen money over love, greed over family, theft over everything I had tried to teach her about right and wrong. I took the pen from her hand, but instead of signing the document, I slipped it into my purse and pulled out a small piece of paper that I had prepared for exactly this moment. While Daniel's attention was focused on trying to intimidate me and Cheryl was watching for my signature, I quietly slid the note across the table toward the window where Sandra could see it. The note said simply, help. Not my decision. Sandra saw it immediately. Within seconds, she was on her feet and moving toward our conference room, her face grim with determination. What happened next would be burned into my memory forever, but it would also be captured on multiple security cameras and audio recordings that would eventually be used as evidence in court. Daniel realized something was wrong when he saw Sandra approaching. His hand on my shoulder tightened to the point where I knew I would have bruises later. What's she doing? He asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Sandra opened the conference room door and stepped inside, her authority as bank manager evident in every movement. Excuse me, she said calmly, but I need to speak with Mrs. Patterson privately for a moment. We're in the middle of an important financial meeting, Marcus Webb said, trying to reassert control. This can wait. No, Sandra said firmly, it cannot wait. She looked directly at me, and I saw understanding in her eyes. She had received my signal, and now the real drama was about to begin. Mrs. Patterson, she said clearly, are you here of your own free will? Are you making these financial decisions without any pressure or coercion? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. The silence in that conference room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as Sandra's question echoed off the walls, waiting for my answer. Daniel's hand was still gripping my shoulder, and I could feel his fingers digging in harder as he realized that something had gone terribly wrong with their plan. This was it. This was the moment I had been building toward for months. Every lie I had endured, every manipulation I had smiled through, every betrayal that had cut deeper than the last. It all came down to this single question and how I chose to answer it. I looked up at my daughter, this person I had loved more than my own life, who was now staring at me with barely concealed panic. I saw the exact moment when she understood that their perfect scheme was falling apart. "No," I said clearly, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I am not here of my own free will. I am being pressured and threatened into signing documents I don't want to sign." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Daniel's grip on my shoulder tightened to the point of real pain. "That's not true," he said quickly. "Beverly is just confused. She asked us to help her with these financial arrangements." "She's been worried about managing her money," Cheryl added, her voice high and strained. "We're just trying to help her get organized." But Sandra wasn't fooled by their desperate explanations. She had seen my note, had watched the dynamic in the room, and could see the fear in my eyes despite my brave words. "Sir," she said to Daniel, "I need you to remove your hand from Mrs. Patterson's shoulder immediately." "This is ridiculous," Marcus Webb interjected, trying to regain control of the situation. "We're legitimate financial advisors helping a client organize her affairs. This bank has no right to interfere in legal financial planning." Sandra's smile was ice cold. "Actually, as the manager of this bank, I have every right to ensure that our customers are not being coerced into financial transactions against their will. And right now, that appears to be exactly what's happening." She moved to a phone on the wall and pressed a button. Within seconds, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway of the conference room. That's when Daniel realized just how serious the situation had become. His hand finally released my shoulder, but instead of backing down, he leaned closer to my ear. "Beverly," he whispered, his voice full of menace, "you're making a big mistake. Think about what this means for your family. Think about Emma and Jake. Think about what happens to them if you destroy their mother's life over some paperwork." He was threatening my grandchildren. My own son-in-law was using my love for Emma and Jake as a weapon against me, trying to manipulate me into letting them steal my life savings by suggesting that refusing to cooperate would somehow hurt the kids. That threat, more than anything else they had done, crystallized my resolve. Because I realized that if I gave in to this manipulation, if I let them get away with this scheme, Emma and Jake would grow up thinking this kind of behavior was normal. They would learn that family members could be used and exploited, that love was conditional, that trust meant nothing when money was involved. I stood up from my chair, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the confused old woman they thought they were manipulating, but Beverly Patterson, a woman who had survived 73 years of life's challenges and wasn't about to be defeated by her own daughter's greed. "Sandra," I said clearly, "I want you to lock the doors to this bank. I want you to call the police. And I want these people to understand that their scheme is over." The next few minutes were chaotic in a way that felt almost surreal. Sandra did exactly what I had asked. She instructed security to lock the main entrance and called Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit. Daniel started pacing like a caged animal, his previous smooth confidence replaced by obvious panic. Marcus Webb began frantically gathering his documents, as if he could somehow escape the consequences by cleaning up the evidence. But it was Cheryl's reaction that broke my heart all over again. Instead of apologizing, instead of showing any remorse for what they had tried to do, she looked at me with pure hatred. "You stupid old woman," she hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you know what this is going to cost us?" Cost them. Not the emotional cost of betraying their mother and grandmother, not the moral cost of attempting to steal from an elderly person, but the financial cost of getting caught. "I know exactly what I've done," I replied calmly. "I've stopped you from stealing everything I worked my entire life to build." "We weren't stealing anything," Daniel shouted. "We were trying to help you manage your money before you made some stupid mistake and lost it all." The audacity of that statement was breathtaking. They had literally been trying to force me to sign documents that would give them complete access to my accounts, and they still maintained they were trying to help me. Detective Morrison arrived within 10 minutes, accompanied by another officer from the Financial Crimes Unit. Sandra had been recording everything since she locked the doors, so they had clear audio and video evidence of Daniel's threats, Cheryl's admission of guilt, and Marcus Webb's attempts to destroy evidence. What happened next felt like watching a movie rather than living through real life. The 3 conspirators were read their rights and arrested for attempted financial elder abuse, coercion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Daniel was also charged with assault for his physical intimidation tactics. As they were being led away in handcuffs, Cheryl turned back to look at me one last time. "I hope you're happy," she said bitterly. I hope your precious money keeps you warm at night when you're all alone, because you'll never see me or the kids again. Those words should have devastated me. The threat of losing contact with my grandchildren should have made me want to take it all back, to drop the charges and pretend none of this had ever happened. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. Because I finally understood that the daughter who could threaten to keep my grandchildren away from me as punishment for refusing to let her steal my money wasn't really my daughter anymore. The person who had tried to manipulate and rob me was a stranger wearing Cheryl's face, driven by greed and entitlement that had consumed whatever love she might once have felt for me. The real Cheryl, the little girl I had raised with such hope and devotion, had been gone for a long time. I had just been too afraid to admit it to myself. After they were taken away, Sandra and I sat in her office going over everything that had happened. The bank security footage would provide clear evidence of the attempted coercion. My private investigator's documentation would show the elaborate nature of their scheme. The recordings I had made over the past few weeks would demonstrate premeditation and conspiracy. Mrs. Patterson, Detective Morrison said before he left, I want you to know that what you did today took tremendous courage. Most elderly victims of financial abuse never report it, especially when family members are involved. By standing up for yourself, you've not only protected your own assets but potentially prevented these people from victimizing others. Others. That thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If they were willing to steal from Daniel's mother-in-law, if they had developed such an elaborate scheme for financial elder abuse, I probably wasn't their first target. There might be other elderly people they had already victimized, other families they had torn apart with their greed. What happens now? I asked. Now they go through the legal system, he replied. With the evidence we've gathered today, plus whatever additional investigation uncovers, they're looking at serious felony charges. This kind of financial elder abuse can result in significant prison time, especially when there's evidence of coercion and threats. Prison time. My daughter was going to prison because she had tried to steal my money. As I drove home that afternoon, I expected to feel victorious. I had won, after all. I had exposed their scheme, protected my assets, and ensured that there would be consequences for their actions. Instead, I felt empty, hollow, like something essential had been carved out of my chest and would never be replaced. Because winning had cost me everything that really mattered. My faith in family. My trust in the people closest to me. My relationship with my grandchildren, who would now grow up knowing their mother was in prison because of something their grandmother had done. I had saved my money, but I had lost my family. And as I sat in my kitchen that evening, surrounded by the silence of a house that would probably never again echo with the laughter of grandchildren or the warmth of family gatherings, I wondered if the victory had been worth the price. But even as I questioned my choices, I knew I would make the same decision again. Because sometimes protecting yourself means losing everything else. Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone. And sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you deepest, and you have to choose between being their victim or being their survivor. I chose to survive. The weeks following the arrests were the loneliest of my life. The silence in my house felt different now, not peaceful, but heavy with the weight of everything that had been lost. I found myself listening for phone calls that would never come, expecting visits from grandchildren who might never forgive me for what I had done to their mother. The local news picked up the story, though they kept my name confidential. Elderly woman foils family's theft attempt at local bank, was the headline that appeared in our small town paper. Seeing it in print made the whole nightmare feel both more real and somehow surreal at the same time. People I barely knew began stopping me at the grocery store, wanting to share their own stories of family financial betrayal or to tell me how brave I had been. But their praise felt hollow when I went home each night to an empty house and a silent phone. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness, though. It was the doubt. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the situation. Had I misunderstood their intentions? Had there been another way to handle things that might have preserved our family relationships while still protecting my assets? Could I have been wrong about the extent of their deception? These doubts led me to do something I probably should have done months earlier. I requested copies of all the evidence the police had gathered, including the phone records and text messages my private investigator had uncovered. Reading through those communications was like getting punched in the stomach repeatedly. Whatever doubts I had harbored about the rightness of my actions evaporated as I saw, in their own words, exactly what they had thought of me and what they had planned to do. There were text messages between Cheryl and Daniel from 6 months before the crisis began, discussing how they could gain access to my money. Daniel had actually researched my net worth online and found public records showing property values and tax assessments that gave him a rough idea of what I was worth. "The old lady is sitting on almost $500,000 if you count the house," one of his texts read. "We just need to figure out how to get access before she spends it all on a nursing home or something stupid." The old lady. That's how my son-in-law referred to me in private conversations with my own daughter. Cheryl's responses were even more devastating. "She'll do whatever I ask if she thinks it's for the family. She's always been a sucker for sob stories about the kids." A sucker. My daughter thought I was a sucker for caring about my grandchildren's welfare. But the worst discovery was a series of messages from after they had received the initial $50,000 loan. Instead of using it to solve business problems as they had claimed, they had immediately started planning how to get access to the rest of my assets. "This is just the beginning," Daniel had texted. "Once we get control of her accounts, we can take everything and make it look like we're just managing her money. By the time anyone figures out what happened, we'll be set for life." "What if she realizes what we're doing?" Cheryl had replied. "She won't," Daniel responded. "She's old and trusting and desperate to help her precious grandchildren. We'll keep her happy with small allowances and make her think she's still in control. Old people believe what they want to believe." Reading those words, I understood that my daughter hadn't been reluctantly swept up in her husband's scheme. She had been an active, willing participant from the very beginning. The tears, the gratitude, the apparent desperation, it had all been performance designed to manipulate me into giving them access to my life savings. But the evidence also revealed something else that gave me a cold satisfaction. They had been planning to eventually have me declared incompetent so they could gain complete control of my assets through guardianship proceedings. They had already consulted with a lawyer about the process, discussing how to document my alleged mental decline and inability to manage my own affairs. In other words, stealing my money was just the first phase of their plan. The ultimate goal was to have me declared legally incompetent so they could control not just my finances, but my medical decisions, my living arrangements, and every other aspect of my life. They had been planning to steal my independence, my autonomy, and my dignity, everything that made me who I was. Reading this evidence eliminated any lingering guilt I might have felt about calling the police. These weren't desperate people who had made a mistake in a moment of financial crisis. They were calculating predators who had targeted me specifically because they believed my age made me vulnerable and my love for them made me controllable. The trial was scheduled for early November, about 4 months after the arrests. During those months, I learned more about financial elder abuse than I ever wanted to know. Detective Morrison kept me updated on their investigation, which revealed that Daniel and Marcus Webb had attempted similar schemes with at least 2 other elderly victims. One was Daniel's own grandmother, from whom he had successfully stolen nearly $30,000 before she died. The other was a widower from Marcus's church, who had lost his entire retirement savings to an investment opportunity that existed only on paper. Knowing that I had helped expose a pattern of elder abuse made me feel better about my decision to press charges. But it didn't ease the pain of losing my family. I had no contact with Cheryl during this period, of course. She was out on bail but had been ordered to have no communication with me as a condition of her release. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was telling anyone who would listen that I had overreacted, that there had been a misunderstanding, that I was a bitter old woman who was destroying the family over money. The story she was spreading painted me as the villain, a paranoid, greedy elderly woman who had turned on her own daughter rather than accept help managing finances that were too complicated for her aging mind to handle. Some people believed her version. I could see it in their faces when I encountered them around town, the mixture of pity and disapproval that suggested they thought I had chosen money over family. But others understood what had really happened. My longtime neighbors, people who had known me for decades, rallied around me with support that helped me get through the darkest days. My church congregation, my former teaching colleagues, my bridge club friends, they formed a network of emotional support that partially filled the hole left by my family's betrayal. The most meaningful support came from an unexpected source: other elderly people who had experienced similar family betrayals. Word spread through senior centers and retirement communities about what I had done, and I started receiving letters and phone calls from people who shared their own stories of financial abuse by family members. Most of them had never reported the crimes. They had allowed themselves to be victimized rather than face the legal and social consequences of prosecuting their own children or grandchildren. They wrote to tell me that my courage in fighting back had inspired them to seek help, to report their own cases, or at least to take steps to protect themselves from further abuse. "You showed us that we don't have to be victims," one woman wrote. "You proved that being old doesn't mean being helpless, and that family members who steal from us deserve consequences just like any other criminals." These letters helped me understand that my decision to press charges had implications beyond my personal situation. By refusing to be a silent victim, I had given other elderly people permission to protect themselves, to demand justice, and to prioritize their own welfare over family harmony. But the most important revelation came from an unexpected source: Emma, my 16-year-old granddaughter. 3 weeks before the trial, I found a letter slipped under my front door. It was from Emma, written in the careful handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and school projects. "Grandma Beverly," it began, "I know Mom told me I'm not supposed to talk to you, but I had to write this letter because there are things you need to know. I heard Mom and Daniel talking about their plan to take your money months before any of this happened. I didn't understand it all, but I knew they were planning to trick you somehow. I wanted to warn you, but I was scared of what would happen to me and Jake if I got Mom in trouble. I feel terrible that I didn't try to protect you. You've always been there for us, and when you needed someone to be there for you, I was too scared to help. I want you to know that what they did was wrong. Jake and I both know it was wrong. We don't blame you for calling the police. We blame Mom and Daniel for being greedy and mean to the person who loves us most. I miss you so much. I miss our talks about books and school and life. I miss the way you always believed I could do anything I set my mind to. I miss feeling like I had at least one adult in my life who put my happiness before everything else. I can't visit you or call you right now because Mom watches everything I do, and she said she'll send me to live with my dad in California if I try to contact you. But I want you to know that no matter what happens with the trial or anything else, I will never stop loving you. And when I turn 18 in 2 years, the first thing I'm going to do is come see you and tell you in person how sorry I am for not protecting you when you needed it. You are the strongest, smartest, most loving person I know, and I'm proud to be your granddaughter. Love always, Emma. I must have read that letter 50 times, crying harder each time I finished it. Emma understood. Despite everything her mother had told her, despite the pressure and manipulation she was undoubtedly facing at home, my granddaughter understood that I had been the victim, not the perpetrator. But more than that, she was taking responsibility for not warning me, feeling guilty for not protecting me from her own mother's scheme. This 16-year-old girl was showing more moral courage and emotional maturity than the 42-year-old woman who had raised her. That letter gave me the strength I needed to face the trial. Because I realized that even if I lost my daughter forever, even if I never saw Jake again, I still had Emma's love and respect. And someday, when she was old enough to make her own choices, we would rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth and mutual respect rather than manipulation and lies. The night before the trial was scheduled to begin, I sat in my living room holding Emma's letter and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal, the investigation, the confrontation at the bank, the arrests, the months of loneliness and doubt. Was it worth it? Had I made the right choice? Looking back, I knew I had. Not just for myself, but for Emma and Jake, who needed to learn that love doesn't mean accepting abuse. For other elderly people who deserve to live without fear of being victimized by their own families. For the principle that trust, once broken, has consequences that can't be avoided just because the people involved happen to share DNA. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom and tell my story. I would face my daughter across a room filled with strangers and explain how she had tried to steal everything I had worked my entire life to build. I would listen to her lawyers try to paint me as a confused old woman who had misunderstood their innocent attempts to help. And I would do it all knowing that I was fighting for something bigger than money, something more important than family harmony. I was fighting for the right of elderly people to be treated with dignity and respect, for the principle that vulnerability shouldn't be exploited, and for the idea that love without trust is just another form of manipulation. The trial would determine their legal fate. But I had already won the battle that mattered most, the battle to remain true to myself and my values, even when the people I loved most tried to convince me that being their victim was somehow an act of love. The courthouse was smaller than I expected, but walking into that courtroom was still one of the most intimidating experiences of my life. Not because I feared the legal proceedings. Detective Morrison and the prosecutor had prepared me thoroughly for what to expect. What terrified me was seeing Cheryl again after all these months, sitting at the defendant's table next to her lawyer, looking like a stranger wearing my daughter's face. She had lost weight during the months leading up to the trial. Her hair was shorter, styled differently, and she wore a conservative navy suit that was clearly chosen to make her appear respectable and sympathetic. But what struck me most was her expression, cold, distant, and completely devoid of the warmth I had associated with her for 42 years. When she looked at me, there was no recognition of our relationship, no acknowledgement that she was facing her mother across a courtroom. Her gaze was flat and hostile, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle standing between her and something she deserved. Daniel sat beside her, his expensive lawyer whispering instructions in his ear. Marcus Webb was at a separate table with his own attorney, having negotiated a plea deal in exchange for testifying against his co-conspirators. The solidarity that had held their scheme together had crumbled as soon as they faced real consequences for their actions. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen, had warned me that Cheryl's defense would likely focus on painting me as a paranoid, confused elderly woman who had misunderstood their well-intentioned attempts to help. She was right. Cheryl's lawyer opened with a narrative that portrayed his client as a loving daughter who had been trying to protect her aging mother from financial mismanagement and potential scams. According to him, I had become increasingly paranoid and suspicious in recent years, unable to distinguish between genuine help and imagined threats. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said in his opening statement, this case isn't about financial elder abuse. It's about a tragic misunderstanding between a family member who was trying to help and an elderly woman who had become so fearful and suspicious that she interpreted loving assistance as criminal intent. He painted a picture of Cheryl as the dutiful daughter, worried about her mother's declining mental capacity and desperate to prevent me from making poor financial decisions that could leave me vulnerable in my old age. The joint ownership documents and power of attorney weren't theft attempts, they were safety measures designed to protect me from my own declining judgment. It was a clever strategy, and I could see some of the jurors nodding along with his narrative. After all, many of them had elderly parents themselves, and they could imagine wanting to help manage their parents' finances if those parents seemed to be making poor decisions. But then Ada Chen began presenting the evidence. The recordings I had made were damning. Hearing Daniel's voice as he threatened me, listening to Marcus Webb's high-pressure sales tactics, witnessing the moment when their caring facade dropped to reveal the cold calculation underneath, it painted a very different picture than the one the defense had presented. The text messages were even worse. When the jury heard Cheryl referring to me as the old lady and Daniel discussing how to take everything, their expressions changed completely. The sympathetic looks they had been giving the defendants were replaced by disgust and anger. But the most powerful evidence came from Marcus Webb's testimony. As part of his plea deal, he provided detailed information about how their scheme had been designed and implemented. He explained how they had researched my assets, planned their manipulation tactics, and prepared the documents that would have given them complete control over my finances. The plan was never just to help Mrs. Patterson manage her money, he admitted under oath. The plan was to gain control of her assets and then gradually transfer those assets to her daughter and son-in-law while keeping Mrs. Patterson unaware of what was happening. And what would have happened to Mrs. Patterson once you had gained control of her assets? Ada Chen asked. Eventually, we would have had her declared incompetent, Marcus Webb answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel had already consulted with lawyers about guardianship proceedings. The plan was to document her alleged mental decline and use that to justify taking complete control of not just her finances, but her medical care, living arrangements, everything. The courtroom was silent as the full scope of their plan became clear. They hadn't just wanted to steal my money, they had wanted to steal my entire life, my independence, my right to make my own decisions. When it was my turn to testify, I felt strangely calm. Months of preparation had led to this moment, and I was ready to tell my story. Ada Chen guided me through the chronology of events, from Cheryl's initial request for help to the confrontation at the bank. I described the manipulation tactics they had used, the psychological pressure they had applied, and the growing realization that the people I trusted most were trying to destroy me. But the most powerful moment came when she asked me about the impact of their betrayal. Mrs. Patterson, she said gently, can you describe for the jury how this experience has affected you personally? I looked across the courtroom at Cheryl, hoping to see some flicker of remorse, some sign that she understood the pain she had caused. Instead, she stared back at me with the same cold indifference she had maintained throughout the trial. I lost my daughter, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. Not through death or distance or any of the natural ways that parents and children grow apart. I lost her to greed and selfishness and a willingness to destroy the person who loved her most for the sake of money she hadn't earned and didn't deserve. I paused, gathering my thoughts before continuing. But more than that, I lost my faith in family itself. For 73 years, I believed that family meant something special, something sacred. I believed that the bonds between parents and children were unbreakable, that love created obligations and protections that would last forever. Several jurors were wiping their eyes as I spoke. Even the bailiff looked uncomfortable with the raw emotion in the room. I learned that I was wrong, I continued. I learned that some people will use love as a weapon, will exploit trust as a tool for theft, and will destroy relationships that took decades to build for the sake of money they could spend in a few years. Do you regret pressing charges against your daughter? Ada Chen asked. It was the question I had been dreading, but also the one I was most prepared to answer. I regret that it was necessary, I said. I regret that the person I raised with love and sacrifice and endless devotion could become someone capable of trying to steal everything I had worked for. I regret that my grandchildren will grow up knowing their mother is a criminal. I looked directly at Cheryl as I delivered my final statement. But I don't regret protecting myself. I don't regret refusing to be a victim. And I don't regret ensuring that there were consequences for trying to destroy my life. The defense's cross-examination was brutal but expected. Cheryl's lawyer tried to paint me as a bitter, vindictive old woman who had misunderstood innocent family dynamics. He suggested that I had dementia, that I was paranoid, that I had imagined threats that didn't exist. But the evidence was too strong, the recordings too clear, the text messages too damning. No amount of legal maneuvering could explain away the fact that they had been caught on tape discussing how to steal my money and planning to have me declared incompetent. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Cheryl was convicted of financial elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted theft. Daniel received additional convictions for assault and intimidation. Marcus Webb, who had already pleaded guilty, was sentenced as part of his cooperation agreement. When the verdicts were read, Cheryl showed emotion for the first time during the entire trial. But it wasn't remorse or shame, it was rage. As the bailiff prepared to take her back into custody, she turned to me with fury blazing in her eyes. "I hope you're satisfied," she said loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "I hope destroying your own family was worth protecting your precious money." Even then, even after being convicted by a jury of her peers, she couldn't acknowledge what she had done wrong. In her mind, I was still the villain for refusing to be her victim. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but I already knew from Ada Chen that Cheryl and Daniel were each likely to receive between 3 and 7 years in prison. Their crimes were serious felonies, and the judge had a reputation for being tough on financial elder abuse cases. Walking out of that courthouse after the verdicts were announced, I should have felt victorious. Justice had been served, the criminals had been convicted, and I had proven that elderly people don't have to accept abuse from their own families. Instead, I felt exhausted and empty, like I had won a war but lost everything that made victory worthwhile. Because at the end of the day, I had been right about everything, and being right had cost me my daughter. But as I drove home that evening, I thought about Emma's letter, about the other elderly victims who had reached out to share their stories, about the precedent this case might set for future prosecutions of financial elder abuse. Maybe losing my daughter was the price I had to pay for protecting myself and others like me. Maybe sometimes being a hero means accepting that the people you love most will see you as the villain. I could live with that. At 73 years old, I had finally learned that being alone was better than being victimized, that self-respect was more valuable than family harmony, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones you most need protection from. The legal system had given me justice. Now I had to figure out how to build a life with what remained. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later was less dramatic than the trial, but in some ways more final. Judge Harrison imposed sentences that reflected the serious nature of their crimes. Cheryl received 4 years in state prison, Daniel got 6 years, and Marcus Webb was sentenced to 2 years as part of his plea agreement. As the judge read their sentences, I watched my daughter's face for any sign of remorse, any indication that she understood the gravity of what she had done. Instead, she stared straight ahead with the same cold indifference she had maintained throughout the entire legal process. But it was her final statement to the court that revealed just how completely she had rationalized her actions. "Your Honor," she said when given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, "I want it on record that I was trying to help my mother. She's getting older, she's becoming more confused, and I was genuinely concerned about her ability to manage her finances safely. What happened was a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion by lawyers and investigators who don't understand family dynamics. Even facing years in prison, she couldn't admit what she had done. Even with overwhelming evidence of her guilt, she maintained the fiction that she had been the loving daughter trying to help her confused elderly mother. The judge's response was swift and sharp. "Ms. Morrison," he said, using Cheryl's legal name rather than acknowledging our relationship, "I've reviewed all the evidence in this case, including recorded conversations where you referred to your mother as the old lady and discussed plans to take everything from her. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a family dispute. This was a calculated attempt to defraud an elderly person who trusted you." He leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of authority and moral judgment. "What makes your crimes particularly reprehensible is that you exploited the most fundamental relationship in human society, the bond between parent and child. You used your mother's love for you and her grandchildren as weapons against her, manipulating her emotions to gain access to assets you had no right to claim." The courtroom was silent as he continued. "Financial elder abuse is not just theft, it's a betrayal of trust that can destroy victims psychologically and emotionally in ways that extend far beyond monetary losses. The fact that you still refuse to acknowledge the wrongfulness of your actions suggests that you represent a continued threat to elderly persons who might trust you in the future." As the bailiff led Cheryl away to begin serving her sentence, she didn't look back at me. No final words, no gesture of acknowledgement, no sign that she recognized me as anything other than the obstacle that had stood between her and the money she felt entitled to take. That night, alone in my house, I finally allowed myself to cry for everything that had been lost. Not just the relationship with my daughter, but the innocent belief that family bonds were unbreakable, that love created unconditional loyalty, that the people closest to you would never deliberately hurt you. I cried for the grandmother I would never be to Emma and Jake, for holidays that would never be the same, for a legacy of family love that had been replaced by a story of betrayal and legal consequences. But even as I grieved, I knew I had made the right choice. The alternative, allowing them to steal my money and eventually my independence, would have been worse than losing their love. Because as I had learned too painfully, their love had conditions and expiration dates, while my self-respect and dignity were mine to keep forever. The story didn't end with the sentencing, though. In the weeks and months that followed, the ripple effects of our case continued to spread in ways I hadn't anticipated. First, the local district attorney's office began using our case as a training example for prosecutors handling financial elder abuse cases. ADA Chen told me that the recordings I had made and the evidence we had gathered provided a textbook example of how these crimes typically unfold and how they can be successfully prosecuted. "Your willingness to wear a wire and gather evidence while you were being victimized was extraordinary," she said during a follow-up meeting. "Most elderly victims are too frightened or too ashamed to take that kind of risk. Your courage made this case prosecutable in a way that many similar cases aren't." The case also attracted attention from elder rights organizations and financial institutions looking to better protect their elderly customers. Sandra Williams, the bank manager who had helped me, was invited to speak at conferences about recognizing and responding to financial elder abuse attempts. More personally meaningful was the continued contact from other elderly victims of family financial abuse. My story had been covered in several newspapers and online publications focused on senior issues, and I received hundreds of letters from people sharing their own experiences. Many of these stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine: adult children who had manipulated elderly parents into signing over financial control, only to drain their accounts and leave them with nothing. But what surprised me was how many people wrote to say that reading about my case had given them the courage to seek help for ongoing abuse situations. "I thought I was the only one," wrote a 78-year-old woman from Oregon. "My son has been taking money from my accounts for 2 years, and I was too ashamed to tell anyone. After reading your story, I contacted the police. Thank you for showing me that being old doesn't mean being helpless." These letters helped me understand that my decision to press charges had implications far beyond my personal situation. Every elderly person who read about the case learned that they didn't have to accept financial abuse from family members, that legal remedies were available, and that protecting themselves was more important than preserving family harmony. But the most important development came 6 months after the sentencing, when I received an unexpected phone call from Emma, Grandma Beverly. The voice on the other end was older, more mature than I remembered, but unmistakably my granddaughter. "Emma." I could barely speak through the emotion of hearing her voice again. I'm 18 now, she said. I graduated early and I'm living with my dad in California. Mom doesn't know I'm calling you, and she can't stop me anymore. We talked for over an hour, catching up on the months we had lost and tentatively rebuilding the relationship that had been severed by her mother's crimes. Emma told me about finishing high school, about her plans for college, about the confusion and pain she had experienced watching her mother's trial from afar. I never understood why Mom did what she did, she said. Even when money was tight, we weren't starving. We had a roof over our heads. Why was it worth destroying our family for money that wasn't even hers? I didn't have a good answer to that question. Greed, entitlement, and poor judgment had combined to create a perfect storm that had destroyed everything our family had once meant to each other. What about Jake? I asked, afraid of the answer. Emma was quiet for a moment before responding. He's still angry with you. He doesn't understand what really happened, and Mom has convinced him that you chose money over family. He's living with Mom's sister now, and they tell him you're the reason his mom is in prison. My heart broke a little more hearing that my grandson blamed me for the situation his mother had created. But I also understood that he was only 14, still too young to fully comprehend the complexity of what had happened, and being raised by people who had an interest in maintaining the fiction that I was the villain. Maybe someday he'll understand, Emma said softly. Maybe when he's older and has some distance from everything that happened, he'll be able to see the truth. Maybe. It was a slim hope, but it was something to hold on to. Our conversation ended with Emma promising to stay in touch, to visit when she could, and to help me find ways to reconnect with Jake when he was ready. It wasn't the family reunion I had once dreamed of, but it was a beginning. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the story of my revenge wasn't really about punishment or justice or even protecting my money. It was about maintaining my dignity and self-respect in the face of betrayal, about refusing to be a victim even when the perpetrators were people I loved, and about setting an example for other elderly people who might face similar situations. I had lost my daughter, possibly forever. I had missed precious years with my grandchildren. I had learned painful truths about the conditional nature of some relationships and the vulnerability that comes with aging in a society that often sees elderly people as easy targets. But I had also proven that age doesn't equal helplessness, that love without respect is meaningless, and that sometimes the people who claim to be protecting you are the ones you most need protection from. The house was quiet as I prepared for bed that night, but it was a different kind of quiet than the loneliness I had felt for months. It was the quiet of someone who had fought for themselves and won, who had chosen self-respect over family harmony, and who had learned that being alone was better than being betrayed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to rebuild my life and my relationships. But tonight, for the first time in over a year, I felt at peace with the choices I had made and the person I had chosen to be. Sometimes revenge isn't about hurting the people who wronged you, it's about refusing to let them destroy you. And in that sense, my revenge was complete. 2 years have passed since that day at the bank when my world exploded and then slowly began to rebuild itself. As I sit here in my living room, looking through photo albums that now tell a different story than they once did, I find myself reflecting on everything that's changed and everything that's stayed the same. The house is quieter now, but it's not empty. Emma visits every few months, and our relationship has grown stronger than it ever was when she was just my granddaughter. Now she's also my friend, my ally, and sometimes my advisor on navigating a world that feels different when you've learned hard truths about family and trust. She's studying psychology in college, and she tells me our story influenced her career choice. She wants to specialize in family dynamics and elder abuse prevention, turning our painful experience into something that might help other families avoid the destruction we've lived through. I want to understand why people hurt the ones they're supposed to love, she told me during her last visit. I want to help families recognize the warning signs before it's too late to fix things. Jake is still distant, still angry, still convinced by the narrative that I destroyed our family over money. But Emma brings me updates about his life. He's doing well in school, playing basketball, growing into a young man who might someday be capable of understanding the complexity of what happened between his mother and me. I've learned to be patient with that hope. Some wounds take years to heal, and some understanding comes only with maturity and distance. Cheryl will be eligible for parole next year. I don't know what will happen if she's released early, whether she'll try to contact me or rebuild relationships with her children. I've had to prepare myself emotionally for the possibility that she might never acknowledge what she did wrong, that she might maintain her victim narrative for the rest of her life. But I've also had to prepare for the possibility that prison might have changed her, that she might emerge with genuine remorse and a desire to make amends. I'm not sure which scenario frightens me more, the unrepentant daughter who still sees me as the villain, or the remorseful daughter who expects forgiveness I'm not sure I can give. Either way, I know I'm stronger now than I was 2 years ago. The woman who almost signed away her financial independence to preserve family harmony no longer exists. In her place is someone who understands that self-preservation isn't selfish, that setting boundaries isn't mean, and that love without trust is just another word for vulnerability. The legal victory brought more than just justice, it brought opportunities one never expected. I've been invited to speak at senior centers and community organizations about financial elder abuse prevention. Standing in front of groups of elderly people, sharing my story and watching their faces as they recognize similar patterns in their own families, has given me a sense of purpose I didn't anticipate. The hardest part, I tell these audiences, isn't recognizing that someone is trying to steal from you. The hardest part is accepting that the person trying to steal from you is someone you love. These speaking engagements have connected me with a community of survivors, elderly people who have faced similar betrayals and found ways to rebuild their lives and their faith in themselves. We share stories, support each other through difficult decisions, and celebrate small victories like grandchildren who choose to reconnect or family members who acknowledge the truth about what happened. One of these new friends, a woman named Dorothy whose son had stolen her life savings to support a gambling addiction, introduced me to volunteer work at a local legal aid clinic. I spend 2 afternoons a week helping other elderly people navigate the complicated process of reporting financial abuse and protecting themselves from further victimization. It's difficult work, emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't expected. Listening to story after story of children, grandchildren, and other trusted family members who have betrayed elderly relatives for money forces me to confront the reality that my situation wasn't unique or even particularly unusual. But it's also meaningful work. Every person I help file a police report, every family member who learns to recognize manipulation tactics, every elderly person who chooses to protect themselves instead of preserving family harmony represents a small victory against the kind of predatory behavior that nearly destroyed my life. If you've been following this story and wondering whether I'm happy with how everything turned out, the answer is complicated. I'm satisfied that I made the right choice, proud that I refused to be a victim, and grateful that my experience has helped other people in similar situations. But I'd be lying if I said I don't sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had handled things differently. What if I had confronted Cheryl privately instead of involving the police? What if I had agreed to some limited form of financial assistance without signing away complete control? What if I had tried harder to separate her from Daniel's influence before things went too far? These questions don't have answers, and dwelling on them too long leads nowhere productive. But they remind me that even when you make the right choice, it's still a choice with costs and consequences that you have to live with forever. The money they tried to steal is still mine, still managed by the same financial advisor who warned me about their scheme. The portfolio has grown over the past 2 years, and I've used some of the gains to support causes related to elder abuse prevention and victim services. There's a certain irony in the fact that the money Cheryl tried to steal is now funding organizations that help other elderly people protect themselves from similar crimes. In a way, her greed created something positive, though I doubt she would appreciate that perspective. My health remains good, my mind remains sharp, and my independence remains intact. At 75, I'm living proof that getting older doesn't automatically make you vulnerable to manipulation and abuse, but it does require constant vigilance and a willingness to prioritize self-protection over family harmony. The most important lesson I've learned isn't about finance or family or even justice. It's about identity. For most of my life, I defined myself primarily as a mother, a grandmother, a family member whose worth was measured by how much I gave and sacrificed for the people I loved. The events of 2 years ago forced me to discover that I'm also a person in my own right, with my own needs and rights and dignity that don't disappear just because I've reached a certain age. Learning to value myself independently of my family relationships was painful but ultimately liberating. I still miss the daughter I thought I had, the family I thought we were, the innocent belief that love was enough to prevent betrayal. But I don't miss being the kind of person who would sacrifice her own security to avoid difficult conversations or uncomfortable confrontations. If I could speak directly to other elderly people who might be reading this story or watching this video, here's what I would tell you: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone is pressuring you to make financial decisions quickly, slow down and seek independent advice. If family members are using your love for them as a weapon against your better judgment, recognize that what they're offering isn't really love at all. And if you find yourself in a situation where you have to choose between being someone's victim or being their enemy, choose to protect yourself. The people who truly love you will understand, and the people who don't understand don't truly love you. Before I end this story, I want to make sure you know where I'm watching from. I'm still here in the same house where this all began, still in the same town where everyone knows what happened, still living the life I fought so hard to protect. If you're watching from somewhere else in this country, or anywhere else in the world, remember that these kinds of betrayals can happen anywhere, to anyone, at any age. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about your own family relationships or your own financial security, please don't just watch and move on. Share this story with other people who might need to hear it. Subscribe to channels and organizations that are working to prevent elder abuse. Support legislation that protects elderly people from financial predators. Most importantly, if you're an elderly person who recognizes patterns from your own life in this story, please seek help. You don't have to face these situations alone, and you don't have to choose between being a victim and losing your family. Sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. The sun is setting as I finish telling this story, and I'm reminded that every ending is also a beginning. The family I thought I had is gone, but new relationships built on honesty and mutual respect have taken its place. The innocent trust one once brought to every relationship is gone, but the wisdom that replaced it has protected me and others from further harm. I'm not the same woman I was 2 years ago, and I'm grateful for that. That woman would have signed those papers, lost her money, and probably her independence, all for the sake of preserving relationships that weren't worth preserving. This woman, the one I've become through fire and pain and the necessity of choosing herself over everyone else's expectations, this woman is stronger, smarter, and more complete than the one who almost gave everything away for the illusion of family harmony. And if that's not revenge of the best kind, becoming the person you were meant to be despite everyone who tried to diminish you, then I don't know what is. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting an old woman's hard-won wisdom mean something to someone besides herself. And thank you for reminding me, by your attention and concern, that not all relationships are transactional, not all love comes with conditions, and not all family bonds are defined by blood. Sometimes the most important family you can have is the one made up of people who choose to care about you simply because you deserve to be cared about, not because they want something from you in return. Drop a comment and let me know if this story helped you in some way, if it made you think differently about family relationships, or if it gave you courage to protect yourself in a situation where you felt vulnerable. Your comments and shares help other people find stories like this, and maybe, just maybe, they'll help someone else choose dignity over victimhood when their moment of decision arrives. At 75 years old, I've learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to demand respect, and never too late to write a different ending to your story than the one other people had planned for you. That might be the most important lesson of all.